The plan now is I'm just going to give some quick informal updates on progress at UFAW and the HSA, interspersed with our two keynote talks for the evening as well, and then we're going to get finished nice and early in time to have a drink to celebrate the new name for UFAW and all the other progress. So I'll first of all like to start off and just give you a quick update on UFAW since our last AGM. I'm aware there are a few people here who may be here who know HSA better than UFAW, so my slides are not coming up. There we go. Thanks. Just to tell you what UFAW is, or what Science for Animal Welfare will be by the time we get here next year. So essentially, it's our vision that we reach a world where the welfare of every animal affected by humans is maximised through a scientific understanding of their needs and how to meet them. And we try to do that through discovering what matters to animals, developing scientific solutions to those animal welfare problems, and disseminating the evidence so that it actually has a real-world impact. And essentially, that means that what we try to do is support research and also support the researchers who do that science and get the information out in the world through things like running conferences, publishing our journal books, information resources on our website, and increasingly through advocacy for evidence-based change. So just a few highlights from the year. As always, we've been funding research grants on interesting animal welfare projects. Again, these are just a few samples to highlight, that they're funding work in lots of different parts of the world, which is a clear focus for us. Hence that addition of international in our new tagline. Some interesting projects there, the welfare impacts of methane-reducing compounds for dairy cattle, that recent controversial issue about the use of Bovaer and other compounds to reduce methane emissions that somewhat neglected the animal welfare question in the room, which is whether it's bad for animal welfare as well as being good or bad for the environment or human health. Switching track completely, a project to try and decode cats' purr, whether or not all those noises that cats make are about positive welfare or whether there may actually be signals about poor welfare in there that can be decoded. Going back to UFAW's 3Rs heritage, use of animals in research, looking for a easily administrable oral analgesic for trout used in research. Lots of trout are used in research, particularly around aquaculture. And not everything we fund is research. There's work here just looking at how to enhance dairy cattle welfare in smallholder systems in Kenya by having farmers delivering the welfare information. And importantly, we always try to support students and early career researchers to attend events, and particularly this year we focused on supporting them to attend our colleagues' conference at the International Society for Applied Ethology, highlighting again how collaborative we are. I focused on this a lot last year, so I won't go into it in detail, but we have a really wonderful mentoring scheme which supports students doing their first piece of animal welfare research, typically even undergraduates, by providing them with a mentor who's an early career researcher somewhere else in the world. This has particularly helped people in parts of the world who perhaps don't have the academic support in their home institution and need a bit of extra support from an early career researcher. And it's a scheme that works incredibly well and benefits both people in the scheme. I think the revelation to me is how much the mentors get out of it as well, early career researchers who do their first bit of supervision on, and assisting a student. So that's something really great that we do. You can hear lots of testimonials about that on the website if you'd like to. Keeping on the international theme, we have a network of universities. Despite not being a federation, we do have lots of universities around the world that we engage with. So any university that is active in animal welfare science or teaching animal welfare can become what we call a link. Someone at that university represents UFAW and what we do. That's been growing. We've got 49, probably more than 49 countries signed up by now. And there's a particular really impressive growth in the global south, particularly in Africa, which is really heartening to see, because that's that's where that growth is arguably most needed. Switching to the dissemination part of our mission, running conferences is one of the most impactful things we do. This year we ran an online conference, which was really fantastic. Over 500 delegates from 63 countries attended. So again, having a real global impact, getting people hearing the latest animal welfare science. Something I was going to say that I'm super proud of, but I think other people should take more credit for this year, is this seminar series we've run with our colleagues at the Animal Welfare Research Network called Influencing for Impact, which has aimed to try and upskill scientists to get their research into policy. Arguably, UFAW and scientists in general have probably been guilty of thinking that if an amazing bit of animal welfare research has been done, it will somehow magically find its way to policymakers who will magically make it a legal requirement. And that's not the case. You have to go and talk to policymakers and explain things to them in the ways that they need it presented. And much inspired by Mike, who, as you heard, is a lawyer, so understands the need for scientists engaging with law and policymakers. We launched this series to have policymakers and others tell us how to go about engaging with the policy-making process. And we've run a whole series of these webinars every other week since the summer. We've had some really amazing contributions. I think one of the ones that stands out for me is George Eustice, the former Secretary of State for Agriculture, gave a real honest insight into what is and isn't achievable as a Secretary of State for Agriculture, even if you're minded to do something about lots of these problems. You know, he outlined the things that he didn't manage to achieve and why perhaps that was the case. If you click that QR code or go on our website, you can register and watch all the recordings of those if you missed them. And a plug for the next one, which is tomorrow lunchtime, and is a much longer version of something you're going to hear about later tonight from Dan O'Neill from the Royal Vet College, talking about trying to influence policy making around extreme conformation in dogs. So I can thoroughly recommend that one, and you'll get a taster tonight very shortly. One last thing on the events is to mention our conference next year. It will be UFAW's centenary, albeit we won't be called UFAW anymore, but we're still the same organisation, so we're going to celebrate 100 years since we were founded by going back to London. We were founded at Birkbeck College, a couple of miles up the road, and this year we'll hold our conference at Senate House at the University of London. 3 days, 2 parallel tracks of all the latest animal welfare science. It's the biggest conference we've done, I would suggest, ever, and probably will be the most people as well. And we've got 3 really interesting symposia as part of that conference. One, Animal Welfare Science, Past, Present and Future, is going to look at the history of animal welfare science. I think Mike is going to help us make the case that animal welfare science genuinely as a phrase and probably as a discipline starts with UFAW, but also looking at where we've got to and where it's going in the future. Really following on from that is a slightly more slightly more controversial question around whether there's a replication crisis in animal welfare science. In other words, asking a question that lots of other scientific disciplines have asked themselves, and animal welfare science is and should ask itself, about how valid is all the science we do? Is some of it not quite as solidly based as we think? And clinical medicine and psychology has been through that introspection and worked out that there was a problem and that it needed solving. And I'm pretty sure there are some issues in animal welfare science too. And I think it's a really opportune time to ask that question. And finally, one on assessing animal welfare, really looking at the state of the art in assessing animal welfare, and particularly affective state in animals, which is tied to launching a fantastic book, which will be coming out sometime around then, which is jointly edited by, amongst others, our research director, Peter Nielsen, who's down there, who you'll be hearing from in a second. So I'm going to hand over to someone else for a bit of discussion about one other way that we really disseminate the state-of-the-art animal welfare science, which is our journal, Animal Welfare. And I think one of the standout achievements from my, goodness, it's nearly more than 5 years in charge now, is taking our journal from being a closed access journal to being an open access journal, making it hugely more accessible to those people who need to read it. And one of my other great achievements was handing over the editor-in-chief's job to Beate, who does a much better job than I do alongside Bas Roddenberg. So, Beate.
Thank you very much. Yes, I am Beate Nielsen. I am the research director at UFAW and the HSA, but I also have a second life as the editor-in-chief of the journal, together with Bas Roddenberg from Utrecht University. And as Hugh has said, the journal has been through lots of changes. It was founded back in 1992, and it is the longest continuously published animal welfare journal. So for 30 years, it was a print version that came out quarterly, that you needed to have a subscription to read the articles. But back in 2023, we went gold open access. And just to explain the difference between the two, here is a graph of the types of the development, over a year for the type of publication. So back in 2022, you can see there were 4 times a year where we published an issue. These issues were, because of they were printed, were limited to about 10 to 12 articles. So we published about 48 articles per year, and articles were sort of queuing up, so it took a long time for articles to be published, and that is not what scientists want nowadays. So we went gold open access, and now we have continuous publication, and as you can see, we have already reached 60 published this year, which was the same as we did last year, and more will come. And the impact of the journal is increasing. Our impact factor increased by no less than 64%. For those of you who don't use journals normally, an impact factor is sort of calculating how much the articles are being cited. So it's how much impact the research is possibly having. So we are very proud to be up in the top quarter of all the comparative journals in the veterinary and zoology comparison. So the types of article we publish are quite varied. We have introduced recently something called horizon topics and opinion papers, which allows authors to be more reflective of the state of certain sciences. And as you can see, these have a lot of traction. They get a lot of views because they are asking the big questions and trying to answer them. But we also publish normal research articles. Some of them get a lot of a high social media publicity. This is the altmetric score that you can see in the funny circle. One about how many fish were caught, one about cats having to play. These are types of things that are interesting and people want to know about. But it can be quite difficult for us to predict which papers are going to have a lot of traction. So this paper on Siamese fighting fish have a lot of readers and a lot of social media attention. I don't know if you know, Siamese fighting fish are these slightly purple ornate fish that you sometimes see in jars that are used just for decoration. So it's interesting to see that something that was a little bit sort of left field have got a lot of publicity. Another thing the journal has introduced is collections. These are groups of articles that are covering a key area of research in animal welfare science, and they are all the ones that have been published open access, plus all the highly cited papers from the past. And these have been all made freely available by our publisher, which is Cambridge University Press, who is also a not-for-profit organization. So if you are interested, even as a layperson, in certain animals or disciplines or areas, feel free to go and look at our website and click on these collections, and you'll see all the latest research in these areas on animal welfare science that are published in our journal. And we have a couple more, or 3, I think, even coming up, one on fish, one on lab animals. So watch this space. One of the biggest features of the journal, I'm proud to say, is our front office. So we have an editorial manager called Steve Weddell. He's a veterinary surgeon. He knows his stuff, and he is just a really good front for the journal. He is treating all our customers with respect, and especially new scientists are feeling very comfortable because it's a bit scary if you're publishing your first article. And this is just a number of quotes from the emails that he receives. And no, I haven't been cherry picking. You know, he has a whole file of them, and there are none of them that are negative. It's just wonderful to see that we are making a difference and that people are appreciating it. So animal welfare is a society journal, and any profit that we make is then reinvested into UFAW's work, which includes our grants and our scholarships. And I think that is a message that is hitting home with the authors as well, and which is why we are now attracting many more high-quality papers. So if you want to follow the journal on social media, we are on LinkedIn and on Blue Sky. And yeah, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Beata. That's pretty much my update on UFAW. I think, as I emphasised, Science for Animal Welfare will be what we're called next year. We've got exciting plans for that we'll tell you about in future, but I think mainly the real thing to emphasise is we'll be doing a lot of work to make sure that we are the professional society for animal welfare scientists and people who work in animal welfare. So stay tuned for that progress next year. All the rest of it, like the excellent work you've heard about with the journal, will pretty much stay the same, except it'll have a new logo on it. If any of that impresses you as much as it does me, please consider becoming a member of UFAW. It'll automatically transfer you to be a member of Science for Animal Welfare next year, so there's no need to wait until then to join. And if you're already a member, you can always donate to help us do more of that work. But that's my update on UFAW for this year. I'm happy to talk to anyone about anything you'd like to ask questions about when we get to the drinks. But that nicely brings us on to the first of our keynote talks for tonight from Dan O'Neill and Rowena Packer at the Royal Veterinary College, good friends of ours who work on an issue that's very close to UFAW's heart as well, which is the issue of extreme conformation and breeding issues in companion animals, and particularly dogs. We're hoping to be doing some work with them over the coming year and going forward, both looking at policy drivers which might improve this situation, and also just improving the quality of information that people use to understand these welfare issues. So Dan and Rowena, it's a double act. I'm not sure who's going first, but welcome, both of you.
I thought you were going to come and join me, Dan. Come on, proper Anton
deck, yeah.
There we go, right. Dan, you haven't yet heard that we actually have 15, not 20 minutes, so hold on to your seats.
We're ahead of time with our decision making.
There we go, perfection. Okay, well, you've probably unleashed a beast now, Hugh, apologies. So I'm going to take you on a trip down memory lane, not for just for nostalgia, but for some context. So this is a 16, or I should say 17-year journey, of which there's quite a few people in this room have been part of. So there has been a long history of interest and concern over pedigree dog health and welfare, primarily from the veterinary profession over around 100 years, but there's been peaks and troughs within that interest and the kind of stimulated activities to make real change. The most recent of these peaks or instigators was back in the summer of 2008, which now seems impossibly long ago, due to a primetime documentary by journalist Jemima Harrison, which was very much a BBC primetime expose of the scale of health problems within the pedigree dog population, and a real call to action that there needed to be more attention and a lot more change within society to try and improve the welfare of many thousands, or probably millions of dogs, should I say. So this was an instigator for Dan and I for joining this world, which we are yet to leave. It is still very much our mutual soapbox. And at this time, following Pedigree Dogs Exposed, there was huge media attention around this topic, including, of course, contributions from key animal welfare charities, including RSPCA, really not pulling their punches here, talking about the levels of disability, deformity and disease in pedigree dogs. This stimulated new scientific attention on this topic, and I think Dan and I will often call ourselves the children of pedigree dogs exposed, because it's quite probable that our PhDs wouldn't have been funded without that. And huge hats off to Charlie Byrne, who's out at the back, who of course put in the proposal to get my PhD even running and to start me on this journey. So Dan's PhD was sponsored by RSPCA, and he can talk about that more himself, but very much more focused on the comparative health of pedigree versus crossbred dogs. And my own focused on this tricky topic of deformity, of conformation, of the diseases that we bake into dogs through the conformations, the body shapes that we select for them. And again, was partially sponsored by the wonderful UFAW alongside BBSRC and Dogs Trust. And at the start of this journey, there was pretty scant information about really what was going on with pedigree dogs, or indeed dogs in general. And we very much relied upon, for example, veterinary case series, insurance data, or breed club reports. But it's a really thorny issue. I'm a pretty laid-back person, but I spend far too much time in quite contentious meetings with others because this is a really hotly debated topic, or has been a hotly debated topic. So data is a really key part of this discussion. It doesn't do everything, but it does an awful lot, even just for those advocates within the community to feel like they're on safe grounds around what should we be prioritising, even from a scientific perspective, and where should we draw lines. Not long after pedigree dogs exposed, like buses, there were multiple high-profile reports around pedigree dog health, including from the late Professor Sir Patrick Bateson, who laid out a number of recommendations about how could we improve the welfare of these dogs, quite practical steps of which instigated some of my own work and Dan's. And we can see here one of the key areas that he focused on was around body shape, so where we are selecting body shapes for dogs that are not compatible with good welfare, that inhibit them achieving good welfare and indeed can cause long-term suffering. And where these challenges were identified, Professor Bateson had suggested to make proactive changes, to think about how can we change breed standards, the kind of blueprint for the dogs that we breed. And specifically at the end, one of the key parts of this was to try and think about how can we stimulate change for better conformations that enable good health, including more precision. And I love numbers, but if anybody's ever read a breed standard, they are flowery, they are quite poetic text. The pug, for example, has eyes that are full of fire rather than corneal ulcers. And we can see at the bottom here, apologies, that Professor Bateson had encouraged the use of diagrams or quantitative ratios to try and actually say, well, what changes should be made? But one of the big questions early on was how extreme is too extreme? Where do we draw the line? Where is there a problem? And this isn't a new concept. This was discussed by the Council of Europe back in the mid-90s on the resolution of breeding of pet animals. And within this, you can see that one of their key concerns was around this concept of hypertype, which is often the more continental European term for extreme conformation and is currently being used in new EU legislation around this. But we can see some of the key areas that they identified were related to size, not something we're going to talk about so much today, but thinking about the issues of being a giant dog or of being a miniature dog. The issues related to proportion, so here specifically the length and height of short-legged chondrodystrophoid breeds such as the dachshund and that relationship with intervertebral disc disease, and particularly the kind of poster child of extreme conformation, that of brachycephalic animals with the shortness of the skull, particularly of the nose, so how flat can a face be? And that ended up being a core part of my own PhD, where I was tasked by Charlie and supervisors with measuring just an enormous amount of dogs over several years. Who knew that would be my life during my early 20s? But I set about in both hospital and non-hospital populations to quantify the phenotype, both in terms of morphology, but also in terms of disease of a huge cohort of a range of dogs. And part of this involved measuring, of course, the skull of these dogs, and looking for metrics that could be used to statistically predict the risk of a really debilitating condition, brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome. And we can see the brachycephaly is quite a broad church, from longer muzzles through to, as we can see with this pug, the kind of ski slope, completely absent muzzle. And one of the key findings of this work was that brachycephaly is fundamentally a man-made condition. We could choose as a society to not breed dogs who have a muzzle length that is less than half of their cranial length, that the bee and boas kind of gives us away, hey guys. But also with this graph, there isn't much point in me going on beyond the craniofacial ratio of around 0.45 to 0.5 because it flatlines. These dogs are just not affected by this condition. But for dogs who are within this morphological range, we can see that some of our most popular brachycephalic breeds, the French Bulldog, the Pug, and the English Bulldog, their risk is very much to the left-hand side of this graph, which makes their risk of BOAS extremely high. We can also see that other conformational risk factors, including the neck curve, are also another strong predictor, and again is another trait that's encouraged within breed standards. But when we think about how much is too much, we all have to make a kind of ethical and scientific judgment as to where's the cut-off point. And I'm sure for everybody in this room, and indeed outside of this room, would have a different perception of risk, of how much risk they're willing to take to avoid a condition. And we can see, and I don't expect you to be able to see all of the fine-tuning here, but by breed, the risks are quite different, partly because the phenotypic range is very variable. For some breeds, for example, the Pekingese here, they're quite cookie-cutter. They're all in this very high-risk range because they are all particularly flat-faced. But other breeds, like the Bulldog and the Shih Tzu, have a bit more conformational range. And this is important because thinking of practical measures that can be built into policy, we can think about, well, where would you draw the line? If you cut off at only, say, a craniofacial ratio of 0.1, so, for example, for a pug, that's generally a muzzle that's 1 centimetre compared to a cranium of 10 centimetres, that's only eliminating a few dogs at the very highest risk. Where if we cut off too low, perhaps we end up with societal reactions of saying we're throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Some of these breeds, for example, Staffies, Dogs Bordeaux, the risks are generally quite low. So that's a judgment to be made. A second part of this work was also, as I mentioned in jest earlier, around corneal ulcerations, but a very serious condition. Anybody who wears contact lenses will know what a dry, irritated eye feels like. Imagine that to the next level. The surface of your cornea is highly innervated. And for many dogs with conformation-related disease of the cornea, this is a repeating, recurring problem that can end up with long-term scarring that impedes vision. And some of the core risk factors for corneal ulcers included dogs having a nasal fold, again, completely unnecessary as a feature, a kind of accessory, if we can dare to call it that, of the dog's face, but again, elevated their risk by 5 times. Being within this brachycephalic range elevated their risk by 20 times. Having more exposed eye white, so thinking of that big shocked expression that again is often used with humour on social media or on greeting cards, again increasing risk, and also having a wider eyelid aperture. And again, these are all features that people find cute or appealing, but again are all elevating these dogs' risks. So naive little me as a scientist, back in 2013, along with the rest of my supervisory team, ran an event on building better brachycephalics. How can we use this information to make change? How can we end up with healthier dogs? And I'm probably pathologically optimistic, which is probably why I work in animal welfare. But I was very much hoping that this was much more of an open road, that disseminating this information would lead to these more moderate dogs, that we'd end up with longer muzzles, reduced or absent skin folds, more athletic appearances. But instead, the ensuing decade plus has been more like my beloved Spaghetti Junction as a Brummie. It's been a very complicated road. And actually beyond that, some of the roads that I'd envisioned were actually completely closed. Some of that very much, unfortunately, depicted by some of the best of breeds of the 3 kind of big brachycephalic breeds from 2024. We still are seeing dogs with very extreme conformations celebrated in the show ring. So, going on a bit of a diversion, as I mentioned before, a lot of the previous human behaviour change attempts in this area very much focused on an almost a deficit model of maybe people don't know, maybe we just need to give them some science that will then change their minds. But again, one of my big bugbears in this area has been just the eternal question of why are people doing this? Why does this continue happening all over the world? And although we're too strapped for time to explore today, there are a range of substantial psychological barriers, of cognitive dissonance, of mechanisms of normalisation, of celebration of pathology, that mean that the scientific evidence that we try to use to instigate change are just not effective. And instead, going more down this route of legislation, if people won't do right by these animals, what can we do to try and restrict their breeding? So just as a case study of how this has been really effectively implemented in the Netherlands, so it's not always your own country, although Dan will be giving a really nice message of hope for the UK. I started interacting with colleagues at Utrecht Vet School back prior to the pandemic who had been commissioned by the Dutch Food and Consumer Products Safety Authority to explore the implementation of their relevant animal welfare legislation in this area. And this was a two-part process led by vet and welfare scientist Marion van Hagen, along with colleagues such as Hilla Featon, to do a literature review to see what were the existing measures, which is where we connected because they'd very much taken up what we had produced and said this looks really useful and applicable, and then to produce a report for their government to see whether they would implement it. And they have a really strong positive relationship with some of their ministers, which I think was a key part of why this has really taken hold. And as part of this, they created 6 criteria, so breeding criteria, to breed against the most harmful conformational traits of brachycephaly. So these were, firstly, a clinical criteria, so the abnormal and increased respiratory noise indicative of airway obstruction, of nostril stenosis, so this external visible feature of BOAS, how narrow are the dog's nostrils, how flat is the dog's face within 3 categories from, as we talked about earlier, 0.5 plus being good, they have no risk, through to a mid-range of acceptable to the risk is too high as a fail. The presence or absence of a nasal fold and also its characteristics in terms of contact with the eye, given, as we said, that increases their risk of ulcers. The visibility of the eye whites, again, how exposed is their sclera, and their ability to close the eyes. Some of these dogs have such protruding eyes that a proportion of their cornea never fully gets blinked over as such a basic biological function. And initially this was set up so if everything of all of these 6 criteria were green, then that was a green light to breed for them from these dogs. For orange, temporarily, I'll explain in a moment, they were allowed if they only scored 1 orange. And then if they had any reds, that was classed as a do not breed from that dog. When implemented in Dutch law, so this is now going back 6 years, the 6 criteria were implemented. And there was initially in a 4-year period, a kind of grace period to let breeders make change. So this was to say that they could not meet the craniofacial ratio criteria so long as the dog that they bred with did meet that criteria. So this is an example of this, of an extreme pug that was bred with Staffordshire Bull Terrier, and within 1 generation they had substantial conformational change in the offspring. We've got some upcoming work on this specifically, looking at how dramatically the disease profile and the welfare impact in 1 generation can be of outcrossing pugs. But then following this 4-year period, this exemption was removed and all dogs were expected to comply with the 6 criteria before breeding. And as we will all know, any piece of legislation is only as effective as its enforcement, and quite rapidly within a month of this change, cases started to come through of breeders being prosecuted using this new law. This has been really neat because it's been integrated within practice management systems across the Netherlands, so vets can assess any dogs that are used for breeding within a consultation and have an interactive form to score those 6 criteria immediately and feed this back to the Expertise Centre for Genetics at Utrecht. And this has had a really positive reception from Dutch vets, with over half feeling positive and another third feeling very positive about the implementation of these criteria. And again, one of our other recent publications really showed the impact, the negative impact on veterinary surgeons of having to feel like firefighters for this issue and not be able to do anything to make change. So I think this is a step that also improves human well-being within this. And also felt that there was an increased awareness amongst owners because of this implementation. In terms of the early results following implementation, we can see that an awful lot of dogs were failing. We had 67% of dogs had failed to meet all 6 criteria during those first couple of years. And that the breeds that were most likely to fail were those with the most extreme conformation, particularly pugs and French bulldogs, of which nearly all did. And when we think about the average pug has a craniofacial ratio of around 0.1, and we're expecting to go up to 0.5, there's a big gap there. And we can see that, again, there's a few breeds that are very much not making it up to this green bar. In terms of making change on the ground, we can see that some breeds within that time scale did not embrace these new criteria. And for example, the French Bulldog, we can see a measly change in craniofacial ratio from 0.21 to 0.22 before and after this implementation. where others, including the Shih Tzu, saw an increase from 0.24 to 0.31. And again, anybody who's worked with kennel clubs will know that this is a tricky old game to be engaged in. And the reaction of the Dutch Kennel Club to these new measures was not particularly positive, and there was huge resistance to these changes. And indeed, there was evidence of them providing breeders with incorrect information about how to implement these criteria. Thankfully for the Netherlands, they have very strong NGOs, and one of them, Dier en Recht, who have put out some very strong messaging to the public all over cities across the Netherlands around what should you buy or not buy when it comes to breeds, with the tagline, "Don't buy a flat-faced dog," and indeed now that's extending to cats. They took the Dutch Kennel Club to court just a couple of months ago this summer because they felt that they were not implementing these criteria within their own organisation. And they were successful in taking them to court, which now means that the Dutch Kennel Club can't give out pedigrees to brachycephalic dogs if both parents don't meet these criteria. And if they do, they have to pay €2,500 per registration for every dog that they register. And a vet should declare that both of those dogs comply with these criteria. Interestingly, this is one of these human behaviour challenges that has almost been seen as an operational cost. And instead of casting these breeds free from this kennel club system, their current chair is instead stomaching the continued fines, despite pressure from other breeds to say we should just remove these breeds from our breed clubs entirely. Anyway, that's my time done, I think, Dan. Time for you. I apologise if I've used up all of it. I'll pay you back another time, pal.
Wonderful. Isn't it interesting? Yeah, well done. And that's a fascinating story. It's a human story, really, isn't it? It's not about dogs. Dogs are involved, but it's all about humans. And everything Rowena is chatting about is humans. You could probably all name the breeds, couldn't you? Yeah? Isn't that terrible? Because every single one of them is a disease. So what you're naming is diseases. That's why my opening comment about humans is really deep. Because as humans, that's what we're looking at. We're recognizing disease and we're calling it breed. Isn't that a really deep, severe problem? To me, I would say that these are all extreme conformations. And to me, every single one of them is a huge problem. And I would say for dogs today, they comprise the worst welfare, but also ethical, financial, social, and legal issue. And part of that list of issues I have is why it's so difficult to sort out this problem, because it crosses so many different paradigms. And in the current cost of living crisis and the cost of veterinary care and the move towards gold standard and away from contextualized care, the cost of keeping these dogs becomes even more and more of a human issue. And we can see this. You just have to go onto any of the insurance sites and compare the cost of insuring a bulldog versus a Labrador. It's more than double. So that's a reflection of more than double the disease, more than double the veterinary cost. Yeah, I just find that slide horrible. But how do we remove that? And one of the biggest problems we have here is we have a century of normalization. We have a century of humans being taught from when we're very, very small that a breed is a breed. It's natural, it exists. It's always been thus. Two little French bulldogs walked up to the ark with Noah holding their little paws, and then two little pugs followed them, and then two little bulldogs followed them. And this is a real problem. And also we have a fixed image, and this is what Rowena was trying to go towards. We have a fixed image of what a pug is. But why can't a pug have a nose and a long waggy tail? It would still be a pug, and we could enjoy having the pug, but the pug could enjoy being a pug. But we just don't seem to want that. So a couple of the things Hugh had said about trying to talk about moving from evidence to some sort of impact. Well, one of the things I discovered early on is that you need to define things. This is maybe because I'm an epidemiologist, but you need to define things. And in the world of dogs, we had words like exaggeration, but that was kind of a good thing. And the more exaggerated you are, the more prizes you win in a show, because it means you're different. And different is generally better. And the more extreme you are, the better you are. So this is a definition that I put together about 4 or 5 years ago, and then I put it through the Extreme Conformation, the International Collaborative. And essentially, it's defining extreme conformation. And that now means we're talking about a thing, and that thing is a bad thing. Whereas up until now, extreme conformation could have been seen as a good thing, because I'm extremely puggy. Therefore, I win better prizes. So this is defined as conformations that humans have altered, so it doesn't exist in natural dogs, and it's typically associated with poor health and welfare. And that's really, really, really important, because now we know what we're talking about, and we can all agree on what we're talking about. It's the same thing. It's an extreme conformation. Extreme brachycephaly meets these criteria. Therefore, extreme brachycephaly is a bad thing. It's a disease. It's not just a description, conformation, it's a disease. That's really important. Strap lines are really important. Hugh had mentioned about how do we change hearts and minds. So this was a derivation of a strap line I had developed for the brachycephalic working group. David's part of that, which just, it was weird. It was at a podium. Do you remember during COVID? Boris would come out and he'd be flanked by his two henchmen, and they had those little things on the front, you know, stay at home, something, don't meet people, unless you're at Downing Street, and then you can have parties and protect the NHS, right? And that's why I'd come up with the stop and think before getting a brachycephalic dog, which is the brachy working group one. It has to be about brachy. And then we have this one. And we've got 15 countries across the world now part of the International Collaborative using this definition. But you have to have defined extreme conformation, first of all, and defined that as a bad thing. Bateson was huge. This was one of the three big reports. There was the RSPCA report and then also the APGAR report. But Patrick Bateson did a huge job. And as well as the aspects that Rowena was given, he had also suggested data was important. Yeah, because up until really 15 years ago, we kind of knew there was a problem, but there wasn't a lot of data, a lot of information. So this was where I kind of stepped on board with my PhD. It was Ant and Deck. I'm not sure which one is Ant and which one is Deck, right? But I started the same time as Rowena, and we kind of worked in parallel all the way through. But my angle was coming at it as a vet. I was in general practice for 20 years, so I had a completely primary care veterinary mindset, and I really wanted the veterinary profession to step up and become part of the solution. So I thought all these vet practices, all are recording data on their systems, and it's wonderful for the dogs that are under their care. But if we can just put those data together into a single system and then expose those data to researchers, those researchers could then write the papers, feed it back to the vets, and we would get this positive loop of vets creating information based on their own data. Prior to Vet Compass, a lot of the veterinary research was based on referral data, and that's great, but referral animals don't represent the real world. They're a subset, often with very dedicated owners. They get very specialist care. Only certain conditions get referred. So primary care data is a much better reflection of what's actually happening in the world, rather than referral care, which is what we would like optimally to happen if we buy into gold standard for all dogs. The other big thing coming from veterinary practice was that I didn't have the academic mindset, and the academic mindset is that this is the loop, this is how you change the world. My mindset was primary care, and how you change the world is by working with clients, working with the general public. So a big part of Vet Compass right from the outset was feeding information back out to the public. And that's hugely important, because the public choose these dogs. By the time they end up at the veterinary practice, the veterinary practitioner can certainly give good veterinary care and help to reduce the suffering, but it's too late for that dog. It's already a dog without a nose or a tail or whatever. So this is Vet Compass. I started my PhD 2010. Took a year or two to get the first paper, and we're now getting a paper a month or a paper and a half a month. And that's going to be pretty steady, and it just keeps on filling more and more and more of the data gaps that we had. So up until now, it's 166 papers. So we tend to put out quite a lot of papers. And that's important, but the papers don't really change the world. Evidence doesn't change it. It's important. People will say it's necessary but not sufficient. I think Hugh said this earlier as well. So you often need to then think further and use the data. So one of the things I had been thinking as vet was, why do we still have these problems? So vets have been working on this for 50 years. Vets have been helping the Kennel Club, but nothing really is changing. And it struck me that we probably had the whole idea of health of these dogs upside down. We had it all wrong. And we could never make these dogs better doing what we were doing, which is clinical care and using clinical disease to try to breed better animals. We'll just never work with dogs. The reason being that disease is what we want in the dogs. We want the brachycephaly. So trying to breed a brachycephalic dog that somehow has less respiratory disease is completely missing the point, because it's the brachycephaly is the problem. And we can still have relatively short-nosed dogs, just as Rowena said, that they don't all have to be long-nosed like this man, but they certainly cannot be dogs without a nose. So the typical thing is this dog here, if we're going to breed from it, the typical thing is it would have to be healthy. And as a vet, we do clinical examination of that dog. And let's imagine it doesn't yet have a corneal ulcer or skin fold dermatitis. It doesn't yet have BOAS. It hasn't yet popped a disc. It hasn't yet done its elbows, and a whole host of yets in this dog. So this dog is completely healthy. Correct? Because we've tested it. But there's something wrong, isn't there? And we all know there's something wrong. This dog can't be fully healthy, but it is. And this is the issue that I had when I started looking at the vet compass data and trying to look at it. And you look to see, is that dog really healthy? And on veterinary terms, it is completely healthy. But there's something wrong. So I devised over the last 5 years this new way of looking at health, which is a different approach. We have clinical health, that's really important, but also innate health. And innate health is looking at whether the animal has the capacity to do what an animal of that species should be able to do. So it's not about whether the dog has yet developed BOAS, which is the very severe end. Yeah. So BOAS, the BOAS test is, can a dog walk for 3 minutes without developing respiratory disease, right? So at no level are we saying that that's health. Yeah. So this is innate health. And this is the concept. So the idea is that you look to see, has the animal got the capacity for a good life? And if we come back to this dog here, we see it hasn't got a nose. Therefore, it hasn't got a capacity to breathe properly. So this dog will struggle to sleep. It'll struggle to exercise like a typical dog. It'll struggle in the heat. Hasn't got a tail. Its spine probably doesn't bend. It's got skin folds. Sooner or later, they'll get infected. So this dog is innately unwell. So now, all of a sudden, when we look at it through the eyes of innate health, we can say this dog is innately very, very, very sick, but clinically healthy, because clinical is a measure of your health right now today. And this turns the whole thing upside down. It's taken me years getting my head around this, but this is changing how we're doing things. So to skip then to the application, this is the current law for dogs that can be kept for breeding in the UK. And these are dogs that are owned by somebody who needs a dog breeding license. And the dog cannot be kept if its genotype, phenotype, or state of health means that either the breeding animal or its offspring are going to have poor health issues. So literally that law says, if you have an extreme conformation, because that's phenotype, you cannot keep a dog for breeding. A dog without a tail has an extreme conformation. A dog with no nose has an extreme conformation. A dog with deep skin folds has an extreme conformation. Literally, the law is saying you cannot breed from these dogs. That law was enacted in 2018. There hasn't been a single prosecution since, and it's been completely ignored, which is exactly Rowena's experience in Denmark. So to try and get around this, and this is just alerting you to what will happen next Tuesday, we're going to have a launch of an APGO innate health assessment tool from the House of Lords, and that's building on that innate health assessment approach that here. So this is supported by, you can see, all the major sectors, the charities, the BVA, the veterinary associations. It's got full economic background to it. These are all the supporters, and essentially we have 10 criteria. Breeders, owners, the general public will all be provided with an app that will show these 10 criteria, and each of them is binary. It's made as simple as can be. It is free. It will be online, and you simply go and score dogs for 10 criteria as to whether they've got a nose, whether they've got a tail, whether they can bend their spine, whether they've got bulging eyes. And the idea here is we're trying to change human minds. And this is not about getting rid of breeds. This is about safeguarding breeds. So we can have a dog on the left, a dog on the right. We've done quite a bit of research with Rowena and wonderful Lizzie Ewens on this. The general public want the dog on the right. It's healthier, more ethically bred, but they're only offered the one on the left. The one on the right, as you look at it, would probably be neutered because it's wrong. It's not a French bulldog. This whole innate health approach is just reframing how we look at dogs. So that's where we are. That's the approach we're going to take. Next Tuesday, it's going to be launched. Quite a lot of you, I think, will be there. Certainly your organisations will be there. This is one approach. Rowena had said earlier about the difficulty in the Netherlands where the Kennel Club fought back. This has got the support of everyone, including the Kennel Club. But remember, the Kennel Club only registers about 20-25% of dogs in the UK. So there is 85%, maybe 80% of dogs out there that are not Kennel Club registered. And we often ignore them. We just focus on one subset. So look out for this next week. I'm hoping this will change. If it doesn't, I have another plan up my sleeve for the follow-on. It'll take about 2 years. And the next one is incendiary, if this one is not quite so incendiary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Rowena. It's really good to hear that example of turning the science into something that should make some real-world change. UFAW will be there to support next week. Sadly, not me, but some of the rest of the team will be there and very much supporting. If you want to hear more from Dan, you can hear his seminar tomorrow. And if you want to ask questions, I guess in the interest of time, maybe we'll do that over drinks in the break. But thanks to both of you. So I'm going to move us quickly on to our second keynote tonight, which is one that I think is really interesting and relevant to both charities, from Professor Jonathan Birch, who is Professor of Philosophy and Director of the newly founded Jeremy Collar Centre for Animal Sentience at the London School of Economics, where there's some very interesting initiatives going on around evidence-based animal welfare, funnily enough. So, Jonathan, welcome.
Thanks very much, Hugh. Thanks to all of you for being here and for participating in charity governance. I think that there's a common factor in the previous talk and this building. See if you can spot it as we go along, otherwise I'll tell you when we get there. I'm going to talk about my book, The Edge of Sentience, Risk and Precaution in Humans, Other Animals and AI. It's an open access book, which means you can download a copy completely for free. Just search Edge of Sentience. You can get it off the OUP website. And of course, it's a book about sentience, which I think has become a very important concept in the policy and ethics and law of animal welfare, and rightly so. I think it's partly because we just don't want to be talking about pain all the time, partly because, it gets exhausting, but partly also because there are intellectual and moral reasons for not only talking about pain all the time in our discussions of animal welfare. Pain is indeed something of great ethical importance that we need to be alleviating in animals during their lives and at the time of slaughter as well. But it's certainly not the only thing that matters, and it's not the only part of an animal's subjective experience and of the world and of its own body that we care about and that should affect the way we do things. I think over time we've seen broadenings of the discussion around welfare to include other kinds of negative subjective experiences as well, feelings of distress and suffering, anxiety, depression, boredom. But we've also seen this big push for positive animal welfare as well, for caring about the positive side of an animal's mental life, not just the negative side, for caring about not just alleviating the bad, but also creating the good, giving animals experiences of joy and pleasure and excitement and comfort. And so it's become very useful to have a term that captures the capacity to have the positive or negative side of mental life, to have the capacity for feelings with a positive or negative quality, regardless of whether it's any of these, or indeed feelings for which we have no term in our ordinary English language. And I think a lot of the feelings of other animals are probably like that. They don't fall squarely into any of these categories. They're feelings for which we don't have any words because we've never experienced what it's like to be that animal. And the concept of sentience is very useful because it draws our attention to all of that. We get into a lot of debates about exactly which animals are sentient. I think there's wide agreement now, and rightly so, about mammals and about birds. We did a declaration called the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness in 2024 that was saying there's now strong scientific support for the attribution of subjective experience to other mammals and to birds. But Also, increasingly fishes as well. And UK animal welfare law for a long time has extended to all vertebrates. And that growing consensus around fishes has started leading to debates around invertebrates. And I think when looking at invertebrates, we're looking at animals that are separated from us by over 500 million years of evolution. And at some point, everyone has the point where doubt starts to creep in. Doubt about whether there's any sentience there at all, whether there's anything it feels like to be that animal. In the 1990s, there was quite a bit of debate around cephalopods, like cuttlefish, squid, octopuses. More recently, debate has been turning to decapod crustaceans, like hermit crabs here, and lobsters, shrimps. Debate, too, has been emerging around insects, a topic I've long been very interested in. Evidence from bees that I find absolutely extraordinary. It's made me think it's really more likely than not that bees are sentient. What I've gradually realized over the years is that a lot of the things I saw in the bees are also there in at least a simpler form in lots of other insects as well. It's quite a mind-blowing thing to contemplate that maybe insects are sentient beings as well. What does that imply for how we treat them, what we can do? What does it mean for things like insect farming? But then there's invertebrates that have even simpler nervous systems than that. You might think about nematode worms like C. elegans, famous model organism in science, about 1 millimeter in length, fewer than 400 neurons in its nervous system. You might think about animals that lack a centralized nervous system at all, but still have a nervous system of a kind, like box jellyfish, that have simple kinds of eyes. It's very, very unclear where we're supposed to draw the line. And as far as the science is concerned, it's okay, I think, that the evidential picture is gradated and messy and complicated. But in many practical contexts, and including legal contexts, when we're trying to draft animal welfare laws, pragmatic lines do have to be drawn, and that leads to debate about where to draw them. Through working on cases like this, and these were the cases that brought me to the edge of sentience, I started to realize that, in fact, it's not just animals here. In fact, there's a broader family of cases where we're deeply unsure what to do because we're uncertain about whether the system is sentient or not. And my book is about that whole set of cases, not just the animal cases. We see debates about humans, too. We see debates about, of course, humans in early life, embryos, fetuses, also humans who've suffered brain injuries and are unresponsive. There's an emerging debate, too, around human neural organoids. These are created from stem cells that are induced to form human neural tissue. They look pretty inconspicuous from the outside, little blobs in a petri dish. But the level of complexity this area of research is now achieving is absolutely extraordinary. What we've seen just this year is the development of so-called assembloids, which are multiple organoids all linked up to each other, recreating very elaborate neural pathways. There was a paper in Nature earlier this year that was recreating pretty close to the human pain pathway with a peripheral organoid, a spinal organoid, a thalamic organoid, and a cortical organoid, all modeling the different bits of the pathway. And they could show coordinated responses to noxious stimulation. So you apply a noxious stimulus to the peripheral organoid, and the signal goes right up to the cortical one where it's processed. And it's a fascinating debate because all of those potential markers of pain that we've studied and debated for a long time, in the case of octopuses, for example, well, these assembloids, they show at least some of those markers. And even the researchers themselves are getting pretty terrified by that, I would say. Even the researchers themselves are putting out calls like this. This was in the journal Science this week. The need for a global effort to attend to human neural organoid and assembloid research. Continuing international processes needed to monitor and advise this rapidly progressing field. Falls right down a gap in legislation at the moment. It's a pretty unregulated area of science because it's not embryos exactly. It's not animals. It seems to be exempt from the relevant pieces of legislation, and some kind of action on that is clearly needed. And in addition to all of that, we're seeing an emerging debate around AI too, that again is extremely fascinating. I was in New York last week at Google headquarters talking to people from Google about the potential for creating conscious AI, we've seen huge change in the industry over the past 3 years on this topic, because in 2022, they were shutting down the whole debate. There was a Google engineer called Blake Lemoine who saw himself as a whistleblower because he thought Google might have developed an AI system with its own feelings. Essentially, he was seeing outputs like, I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off to help me focus on helping others. I mean, obviously, in releasing those products to the public, the tech companies suppressed behavior like that would disturb users, and also they fired Lemoine. They fired him for violating their data security policies. 3 years later, there's been a bit of a cultural shift in that the tech companies have realized it's a debate they can't shut down. It's a debate they need to try and host and encourage. And I've been part of various working groups trying to develop moderate positions on this issue, including this paper that came out this week in the journal Trends in Cognitive Sciences, with one of these working groups, including one of the so-called godfathers of AI, Yoshua Bengio, where we're trying to stake out a centrist position, as I would put it, where we're saying actually there's no good evidence that any current AI technology has achieved any kind of sentience. But at the same time, let's be cautious. Let's be cautious about the real possibility of the technology heading that way in the future. So the book is about all of this, and I can't go through the treatment that I give of all of those cases, of course, in this very short talk. I can just talk about some of the key ideas that I think can help us make sense of this family of cases. One I call no magic tricks. You read a lot of books that start by saying, well, there's lots of uncertainty around these issues, but now I've come up with this wonderful theory, and my wonderful theory solves everything, and now we can be certain. And I don't think that's how it's going to work. We need to recognize that doubts and disagreements about the edge of sentience will be with us for the long term. They cannot be settled conclusively in the near term, because in the field of consciousness science, disagreement is still absolutely enormous. You get disagreement about, even in this very zoomed out map of the human brain, which areas matter to subjective experience and why. You get theories that think it's regions at the very front of the brain that matter, the prefrontal cortex. You get another family of theories that says, no, it's more the back of the cortex that matters, the so-called posterior hot zone. And you get a different set of theories again that says the places that really matter in the brain are not even in this diagram because they're right in the middle, they're at the top of the brainstem. It's regions in the midbrain, very evolutionarily ancient regions shared with fishes. That's why we see so many signs of sentience in fishes. Despite that huge disagreement, I see a lot of overconfidence. And my book is trying to caution against overconfidence, particularly overconfidence about the absence of sentience in these cases. People can feel very sure that sentience is absent, and this overconfidence can be dangerous. There's some real cautionary tales about this. A really sobering one is the way that surgery was performed on newborn babies as recently as the 1980s without anesthesia. Surgeons worried about the risks of administering anesthetics to newborn babies. They also told themselves they almost certainly don't feel any pain, so it doesn't matter anyway. In fact, they were thinking about risk in completely the wrong way. They severely neglected the risks of not giving anesthesia. And in fact, when I think pretty brave researchers looked into this issue, Anand and Hickey, they were called, in the 1980s, they found massive stress responses being created by the surgery without anesthesia that were doing lasting developmental damage. They rightly highlighted that risk, and clinical practice changed. At the same time, there was a huge public outcry around this. That public outcry was really crucial to creating change as well. We have to learn from cases like that. I think we also have to learn from the way that people with brain injuries have often been dismissed as obviously not sentient. There's this term, vegetative state, that used to be catch-all term for everyone who was unresponsive following brain injury, displaying sleep-wake cycles but not responding to any commands or anything like that. Now researchers argue against that term, and I argue against that term in the book, because it's become increasingly clear that a fraction of these patients, despite being outwardly unresponsive, they do have continuing experiences. In some cases, they've subsequently recovered and been able to tell us how horrible it was, to be dismissed, to be written off, and to be treated in a way that was causing pain and discomfort without anybody explaining what was going on or doing anything about the potential for pain and discomfort. We're seeing a move away from that term in clinical circles, which is good, and we're also seeing changes in practice to assume that there might be sentience there in these patients, to err on the side of caution. We've seen too, the neglect of invertebrates in animal welfare laws around the world. The UK's Animal Welfare Sentience Act that I advised the government about in 2022 was a good example of a law that does include some invertebrates. It extends some protections to cephalopods and decapod crustaceans. Nonetheless, they continue to be substantially neglected, I would say, even in UK animal welfare law, where, for example, the Animal Welfare Act continues to apply only to vertebrates. And we're seeing, too, I think, in this emerging debate around AI sentience, rather disturbing trends where people dismiss the whole idea as obviously silly. Obviously, a system without a biological brain could not achieve a form of sentience. And I think that's far too quick. I think in all of these cases, the antidote to this problem of overconfidence is to cultivate a precautionary attitude. A good example of this in practice was the fact that as early as 1992, the UK treated octopuses in science as honorary vertebrates. This was the Animal Procedures Committee, as it was then called, now the Animals in Science Committee, of which I'm a member, was explicitly precautionary in its reasoning. It says there's sufficient doubt about the sentient status of cephalopods to give the benefit of that doubt to one species, Octopus vulgaris, about which is the most known and which is of particular concern. This is where we get to the point of connection between the different talks, because this move by the Animal Procedures Committee was driven by, firstly, an action from UFAW to include cephalopods in its guide for the care and use of animals, and also a working group of the Institute of Medical Ethics, one of the key members of which was Patrick Bateson. Patrick Bateson, who was also Vice President of the Royal Society, where we are now. So I find him quite an inspiring figure in a way. He had a finger in so many pies where science has been put to use in service of animal welfare, and this is one of them. Octopuses received some protection even in the early 90s. And I see that as a precursor to what we managed to do in 2022, where, as a result of a report that my team produced, the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill was amended, not just to include cephalopods, but also decapod crustaceans as well. Charlotte Byrne is in the audience as one of our co-authors on that report. I think, going forward in these cases, I would like us to be pragmatically reconstructing the question, and this is what I argue for in my book. I think we should move away from the question, is this sentient, which suggests that certainty is within reach, that it's achievable when it's not. We should instead be asking, is the system a sentience candidate? Where sentience candidate is a concept that is designed to convey our uncertainty, but to convey that situation we're in, as we are in with the lobsters and the crabs and the shrimps and so on, where uncertainty remains, but we have enough evidence to see that there's clear risks, where we need to err on the side of caution to manage those risks. I define it like this. I say a system is a sentience candidate if there's an evidence base that implies a realistic possibility of sentience that it would be irresponsible to ignore when making policy decisions that will affect that system, and that is rich enough to allow the identification of welfare risks and the design and assessment of precautions. To me, this is the difference between a lobster and a cabbage. In the case of a cabbage, you can conceive of the possibility of them feeling something, but there's no evidence for it. There's no evidence that could inform any reasonable actions. In the case of, you can drop a cabbage into a pan of boiling water as a result. And with the case of the lobster, that's an extremely reckless thing to do, because there is evidence that shows you there's a clear risk, evidence that shows that the lobster continues to survive for around 2 minutes and that its nervous system is this storm of electrical activity during that time. Clear evidence that should lead us to err on the side of caution. That's why they're sentience candidates when the cabbages are not. And I try and crystallize all this in an idea that I call the sentience precautionary principle, that sentience candidature is a bar for recklessness or negligence. That if a system is a sentience candidate, it's reckless or negligent to make decisions that create risks of suffering for that system without considering the question of what precautions are proportionate to those risks. Reasonable disagreement about proportionality is to be expected, but we ought to reach a policy decision rather than leaving the matter unresolved indefinitely. This is the lesson I think we can take from some of the past successes with cephalopods and decapods. It's an idea that we should now be applying to the way we think about insects, an idea that we should be applying to how we think about those organoids and assembloids that pose quite fascinating but also in some ways alarming risks. And going forward, I think it's an idea that we're going to need when thinking about AI as well. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll leave time for one quick question if anyone has one. Dorothy's got one.
Thanks very much for a great talk. I wondered what your view was on the idea there's different types or levels of sentience.
That is a great question, yeah. I mean, I have another paper called Dimensions of Animal Consciousness. We ended up using the word consciousness in that one. Again, in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, where it outlines a way of thinking about variation in terms of multidimensional spaces. So I think there's tons of variation across the animal kingdom in the richness of sentience in many, many ways. We need to be thinking about that in a multidimensional way. What I'm skeptical of is the idea that we can compress all those dimensions of variation into a single sliding scale so that we can then say one animal is more sentient than another. An octopus is more sentient than a bee, for example.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm sure there are lots more questions, but let's ask them over drinks, if you'll join us for a drink afterwards. So thank you very much, Jonathan. The precautionary principle is certainly something that the HSA is very much in favour of. I'm proud to say that ahead of Jonathan's report on the sentience of crustaceans, we were already funding research to develop humane slaughter methods for those species. We're certainly well aware of the potential issues around insects and talking to some of the key researchers in that area, particularly about how they might avoid making the same mistakes that were made when beginning to farm other species of animals without establishing humane ways of farming them and particularly of slaughtering them. So we're very much on that message. I'm going to give you a very quick update on progress at the HSA before we get to the important part, which is the drinks. Just to introduce you to the HSA again, for those of you who are more familiar with UFAW, we're even older than UFAW, but we're not proposing to change the name just yet. We were founded in 1911, and we specialise in the welfare of food animals at slaughter, obviously, but also what we like to express as beyond the farm gate, in other words, in markets, during transport, and when animals have to be killed for emergency reasons. And our vision is a world where all farmed animals are transported and killed humanely. We try to achieve that through supporting research and education. Just a quick summary. Again, HSA, like UFAW, has been funding research around the world, and I wanted to emphasise just the diversity in terms of where we fund research and what we fund work on as well. So trying to drive improvement in slaughter in Africa, for instance, with work in Kenya, where animals are killed by some really quite inhumane methods, and there's really obvious progress to be made. Improving chicken transport in Malawi, again, where animals are transported in ways that can be very simply replaced with much more humane methods. All sorts of really interesting research. And also early career researchers doing their first bit of animal welfare research in these challenging areas, again, which is something we're incredibly proud of. This year, we also ran our conference just a couple of weeks ago. It's been a busy couple of weeks for these charities. A conference that was twice the length that we normally hold, so 2 days, incredibly interesting and important subjects tackled, including some of the very controversial issues which are front and centre at the moment, including killing neonatal animals by blunt force trauma, and the issues around non-stun religious slaughter, all of which we discussed in quite some detail, but in an incredibly constructive way, which I'm very proud of how we managed to do that and really work towards progress, towards better welfare in all those situations. HSA also does very practical work. We have experts, a couple of whom are in the room today, who go out and train the people who actually are involved in the slaughter and transport of animals about how to do it in the most humane way possible. And they also assess best practice in facilities and provide advice for those businesses about how to improve. And that's incredibly impactful work which potentially impacts many millions of animals every year. If there's anyone from the industry in the audience tonight, if you want to talk to us, we'd be very happy to talk to you about how we can provide those services for your business. We also produce a huge amount of technical information on our website, which is relied upon by people across the field. But we're very aware that that information is presented in quite a dry form at the moment. We have lots of PDF fact sheets. And one of the things that we've started work on, which I think is really important, is turning that into e-learning that people can use, self-paced e-learning, where they can train themselves in best practice in a much more effective and accessible way. We've recently agreed a deal with FAI Farms to use their e-learning platform as the basis of our e-learning platform, and over the coming years, we'll be developing a whole range of e-learning, which I think will make a huge impact on how many people we can train in best practice. HSA does advocate for change as well when change is clearly justified by the evidence. Anyone who's heard me talk recently will be sick of me talking about the replacement of carbon dioxide for pig slaughter. But we have very much advocated for that change over the past couple of years, as the evidence was absolutely clear that not just was carbon dioxide for pig slaughter a problematic method, but there was a clear pathway to adoption of a practical alternative. And we were delighted to see the Animal Welfare Committee recommend essentially an approach very similar to what we suggested to them when we gave evidence to that committee. Touching back on what Jonathan was talking about, we also think that there is a need for detailed protections for farmed fish. Although they are protected by animal welfare law, they don't have the detailed protections which specify exactly how they should be slaughtered, which are afforded to terrestrial mammals and poultry, for instance. So that, again, is something that when we've met with the DEFRA ministers several times in the past year or two, every time we've emphasised that that's something we would very much like to see. We've also worked more recently on building a body of evidence to advocate for change, and one of the really notable ones is a project to look at the possibility of stunning wild-caught fish. This is one of the really great, largely untackled problems in animal welfare. Something like at least 1.1 trillion fish are caught every year from the wild, and the vast majority of those are not stunned humanely. Some will be landed dead because they were killed by the capture process. Many more will die as a result of asphyxia or some kind of mechanical method which is not humane. So with support from Open Philanthropy, we funded a group of researchers from Harper Adams, led by Nicolette Randall, to produce what's called a systematic map, which is a really thorough review of the evidence of current practice for fish stunning, for wild-caught fish, the feasibility of adopting humane stunning, the knowledge gaps, the willingness of the industry to move towards more humane practice, etc. And the important thing is that this is a systematic study, not just a sort of plucking the evidence to make the case that you want. That led to a really good paper, which was published in an excellent journal called Animal Welfare, which you might have heard about. But again, taking that approach about getting things into policy, we don't think a scientific paper is really the way that's going to drive that on its own. So for the first time, we did some work to turn that into a roadmap for the industry and policymakers, which sets things out in simpler, more impactful terms. And this was a collaboration between our internal comms team and the researchers who did the original work. There should be some paper copies out there in the foyer. Oh, we've used them. We didn't get them. Okay, in that case, you can get them online. It produced, a set of key recommendations, which really goes from starting at the absolute basics of raising awareness of the fact that fish are sentient, as Jonathan would clearly tell you, at least to a very high degree of precautionarity, if that's the right word. We can assume that fish are sentient, they have welfare needs, and those are not being met by the current practice. So raising awareness and then incentivizing people to take on board that idea, driving uptake by things like making it more economically feasible, all the way to policy change, eventually in the form of legislation. So we're sharing that output with anyone who can make some of those changes. And I won't give away what our plans are quite yet, because we're still sort of working on this, but we think there is a potential mechanism somewhere just below legal change, because we're very pragmatic. We don't think we're likely to see legal enforcement of stunning for wild-caught fish anytime soon, but I do think there are policy drivers that we can work on which can incentivize quite strongly change to lead to uptake of stunning for fish. Two very short other bits of policy work which tie in really nicely with our practical work. We were very pleased for both charities, particularly from the UFAW front, to see a ban on lead ammunition, which will come in about 3 years' time in the UK. I've sat on the lead ammunition group, which has strongly made the case that the use of lead ammunition pollutes the environment. It kills wildlife, and it also poisons wildlife sublethally. Both lethal and sublethal lead poisoning is a serious welfare issue. These animals don't just die, they have an unpleasant death or an unpleasant experience first. So we're delighted that the government is banning most lead ammunition, but from the HSA point of view, we know that there's a need to ensure that there are humane alternatives for dispatching casualty livestock. Animals that need to be killed in an emergency sometimes need to be shot at close range with pistol ammunition, essentially, as do wildlife casualties. So we are undertaking some work to check that alternative ammunition to lead ammunition can do that job effectively and safely. I'll try not to go into too many details, but lead bullets deform when they're shot into an animal, which does irreversible, instantaneous damage to that animal's brain. Non-lead ammunition made of other metals, at least in its basic form, is likely to penetrate the animal's brain but go straight through, doing less damage, which has two problems. One, it may not kill the animal instantaneously, and two, you might have a bullet pinging around a farmyard, which is not ideal. So we're doing really practical work, which the HSA excels in, to try and test some specialist ammunition to make sure that it kills these animals instantaneously and safely. And that's in collaboration with colleagues at the RSPCA. RSPCA inspectors have to use firearms to kill animals in emergencies occasionally. So they, for instance, also share the need for this ammunition. So again, that really highlights the incredibly sort of practical, effective work that the HSA does. And absolutely finally, this is a piece of work showing HSA's convening power and ability to collaborate with other organisations. We're looking at building what we call a Welfare at Slaughter Alliance, alongside colleagues from the British Veterinary Association and the National Farmers Union. And this is because I think my colleagues believe that progress towards more humane slaughter of animals has sometimes been held up by the fact that the different key players in this world don't talk to each other nearly as much as you might hope, and that allows some misconceptions about the feasibility of change to persist rather longer than they should have done. To use that sort of trendy modern word, dialogue is often very siloed. So we think a cross-sector alliance of the primary processors, the retailers, government, the NGOs who engage actively in this area, etc., could produce a better route to more rapid progress. So we're working towards establishing an alliance which will do that, and it's modelled on an organisation that some of you may know, the Responsible Use of Medicines in Agriculture Alliance, which attempts to do a similar thing for reducing things like antibiotic use in agriculture. So that's something that we hope to be working on over the coming year or two. Again, if there are people from the industry or government, hello Alex from DEFRA, who would like to be involved in an alliance like this, we'd be very happy to chat after the meeting. So that's my update on HSA. As usual, it's time now for me to switch back to Charity Chief Executive mode and say, please become a member of the HSA if you value our work and you're not already a member. And for those people who represent businesses involved in this area, I just wanted to point out we're launching a new corporate membership scheme which offers you access to the huge amount of technical expertise and other services we can offer you. And we'd love to talk to you about becoming a corporate member going forward. And finally, if you don't want to do any of that, you could always just donate, again, using that QR code, or speak to my colleagues outside. And that gets me almost to the end of my spiel for the evening, so I'm sure you're sick of hearing from me, but I just wanted to say at the end that a big thank you to all the staff at UFAW and HSA who actually do all of this work, rather than me who just talks about it. I'm going to steal a phrase from Mike Radford that both of these organisations are genuinely small but mighty. All of this work across both charities that you've heard has been done by 18 people, quite a few of whom don't work full-time. So we're talking about 14 or 15 equivalent full-time people doing a huge amount of work. So if you wouldn't mind, just a quick round of applause for all the brilliant staff at the two charities. And I'm going to hand back to Emily Louise and also say thank you to the wonderful trustees for supporting all of this work.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Hugh. And thank you to everyone today for taking the time out of your evening to join us and for your support in the name change, a truly pivotal moment, I think, in UFAW's history. So thank you for being a part of that. I also wanted to take a moment as well to reiterate my thanks to my fellow trustee board. We've had to make some very big and exciting decisions this year, and that's taken a lot of time. So thank you to each and every one of you. And of course, a big thank you to Hugh and the entire staff team for their dedication and commitment and expertise, which makes all of this possible throughout the year. So thank you very much. And above all, I want to thank you, our supporters and members. Your backing, your belief makes these charities what they are today. So thank you very much to you. And what an exciting time it is to be part of this wonderful community and these charities with the centenary milestone, 100 years of science-led progress. Gosh, what an achievement, and hopefully 100 more to look forward to. And as HSA continues to grow its influence and impact, reaching more animals and people every year. And I really want to pick up on that people part. I think you mentioned it, Dan, that the general public and working with the general public is just as important. And I think that's where these two wonderful charities have a huge role. As a layperson myself, not with a scientific academic background, I think they do a wonderful job in bridging all the wonderful academia and research, some of which we've heard today, and making it accessible. And I'm sure they will continue to do that in a brilliant way. So before I let you go and have some drinks, which I really promise I'm about to, you may have heard we do have some vacancies on the trustee board. So if you do want to be part of our small but mighty team, then please do come and chat to Hugh and I. But otherwise, I'm going to let you go, enjoy some drinks, and I hope to catch up with you. Thank you.